right, these notes are going to go into your HBS course file. So these are associated with neurological diseases and dysfunction. So I have, on the right-hand side, I've got my insert, and then I've got some information underneath it. Okay. All right, multiple sclerosis. I remember multiple sclerosis deals with the myelin sheath. Progressive destruction of the myelin sheath of the neurons in the central nervous system. This is usually due to an autoimmune disease. You may know Montel Williams, Jack Osborne. These guys have multiple sclerosis. I have some more information on multiple sclerosis underneath. So, neuron death from myelin sheath destruction causes lesions. Neuron death from myelin sheath destruction causes lesions. So there's lesions in the brain. Alzheimer's disease, talked about that a little bit. Plaque builds up. We have loss of nerve signal that goes through, loss of communication. Got some more information on Alzheimer's. Amyloid plaques from normally produced protein, but the body can't get rid of it. So these are proteins that your body's normally producing, but your body can't clean them out, and so they end up sticking together and forming plaques. Amyloid plaques from normally produced protein, but the body can't get rid of it. Epilepsy, we're probably familiar with epilepsy. Parkinson's disease, Michael J. Fox is a person who has Parkinson's disease. So we no longer have dopamine secreting cells, or they break down over time, so we have loss over time. And so that causes our issue with Parkinson's disease. ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Stephen Hawking is a famous person you might know of, the guy in the wheelchair. He had ALS, and he actually lived a lot longer than they expected him to. So this is a motor neuron disease rather than an issue with the brain. The motor neurons die and can no longer send signals to the muscle, so the muscles begin to atrophy or wear away. So multiple sclerosis myelin sheath is destroyed. ALS, the motor neurons themselves are destroyed. Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a genetic disorder. So, neurons die because genetically programmed damage to neurons in the brain. Nerve cells die, autosomal dominant disease. It's a dominant disease. That means that you only need to have one capital letter in order to have it. The reason why people don't realize that they have it and end up passing it on is because the symptoms don't start coming on until you're older. So I have more information over here for Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease is a mutation in the HTT gene. It creates an abnormally long Huntington protein. The protein is then cut into smaller toxic fragments that accumulate in neurons. The onset of symptoms is from the 30s to 40s. This is a fatal disease, and life expectancy once you get symptoms is 10 to 30 years. So mutation in the HTT gene, abnormally long Huntington protein is created. That protein is then cut into smaller toxic fragments that accumulate in neurons. The onset is in the 30s and 40s, and fatal, your life expectancy is 10 to 30 years. All right. So I have a star next to ALS, a star next to Parkinson's, a star next to Alzheimer's diseases. And so on the side right here, I added information for these. The cause is unknown. It could be genes, it could be environmental factors, it could be an illness that brings it on. Don't really know a definite cause. All right, underneath my insert, I have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. This is a prion disease. It is a neurodegenerative disease. Your life expectancy is about 1 year after symptoms because the degeneration is so rough. So after about a year, you end up in a coma. Then eventually it's heart failure, respiratory failure, things start to shut down. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a prion disease. So prion diseases are kind of like mad cow disease. We have a misshapen protein. This is a neurodegenerative disease. So it is breaking down the brain tissue, breaking down the nervous tissue. Life expectancy is about 1 year. Usually the patients will fall into a coma and then they have heart or respiratory failure. Cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is due to brain damage that causes loss or impairment of motor function, damage or abnormal development of the brain before, during, or immediately after birth. So cerebral palsy, brain damage that causes loss or impairment of motor function, the damage or abnormal development of brain before, during, or immediately after birth. Congenital insensitivity to pain. This is an autosomal recessive condition. You can't feel pain and or temperature. So that sounds like that would be a great thing, but it's not, because then you don't know if you're stepping on something or if you don't know if something's pushing on too hard or anything like that. You don't feel inside pain, so you don't know that things are wrong internally. Congenital insensitivity to pain, autosomal recessive, cannot feel pain and or temperature. All right, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And on the right, left-hand side, I've got my pictures at the top, and I'll go over those in a minute. I want to do aphasia. So aphasia is the inability to understand or express speech. It's usually caused by brain damage. So aphasia is an inability to understand or express speech caused by brain damage. Sometimes Broca's condition is called Broca's aphasia. And then peripheral neuropathy. Peripheral neuropathy is the gradual onset of numbness or tingling in the feet or hands, radiating to the arms and legs. You have extreme sensitivity and muscle weakness. Peripheral motor and sensory nerves are damaged from injury, disease, or infection. Peripheral neuropathy, the gradual onset of numbness or tingling in the feet or hands, radiating to the arms/legs. Extreme sensitivity and muscle weakness. Peripheral motor and sensory nerves are damaged from injury, disease, or infection. All right, so some of the terms on that page with the insert. So atrophy, this is showing a healthy brain and atrophy of brain tissue. All right, so atrophy is fatal with very limited treatment. Brain regions shrink as neurons die. Neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, mad cow disease. So lifespan is usually up to 8 years whenever there's the onset. So atrophy of brain tissue is fatal with very limited treatment. Brain regions shrink as neurons die. This happens with neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, prion diseases like mad cow, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Lifespan can be up to 8 years after onset of symptoms. Depends on the healthiness of the person, how far along the disease is, stuff like that. All right, so this picture right here, we're showing multiple sclerosis. We're showing how that myelin sheath is degraded. So this can lead to neuron death, but you usually have a normal lifespan with proper treatment. So it can lead to neuron death if that degradation goes on too much. It can lead to neuron death, but can have a normal lifespan with proper treatment. Parkinson's disease. For Parkinson's disease, we are losing those dopamine secreting cells. It can reduce life expectancy, but it is treatable. So if it's caught early, it's manageable. Can reduce life expectancy, but it is treatable. So if it's caught early, it's manageable. ALS was degeneration of the neuron, the motor neuron. So healthy neuron, and here's a neuron that's wasting away. ALS is fatal. There is no cure. The average life expectancy is 2 to 5 years, but Stephen Hawking lived for over 50 years after diagnosis. He was an amazing case. So ALS, there's no cure. Average life expectancy is 2 to 5 years, but Stephen Hawking lived for over 50 years after diagnosis. All right, some differences in some of the terms. So we talked about a lesion. So multiple sclerosis ended up creating lesions, which is damage. Lesion is damage. Plaque, like Alzheimer's, we have the amyloid plaques. Plaque is a deposit, something that is being left behind. Lesions can form plaques and vice versa. So lesions, the damage can form a plaque, the plaques can form damage. Epilepsy drugs act on voltage-gated sodium or calcium channels. So we have these drugs for epilepsy that are specific to act on voltage-gated sodium or calcium channels to help ease that excess activity. All right, the one last thing I have is a repeat. We've talked about this in PBS. Congenital is a disease or dysfunction that a person is born with. Congenital is a disease or dysfunction a person is born with. Acute is a disease that is very urgent, comes on rapidly. It can be severe, but can be treated / cured. So acute, things that are urgent, rapid, can be severe, but can be treated / cured. Chronic diseases are long-lasting or lifelong disease or dysfunction. If it's chronic, it's long-lasting or lifelong disease or dysfunction. Then underneath here, just some examples for myself. So examples of congenital disease, Down syndrome, or a cleft lip. You're born with that. Acute, broken bones, asthma attacks that come on suddenly, but they can be treated. Chronic diseases, something that are long-term or lifelong, cancer or diabetes.